Thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring today's video. Learn more about them with the link in the description and pinned comment. Imagine leading the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, straight into the heart of Russia. You expect a quick, decisive victory. Instead, it becomes the greatest disaster in military history, and the tragedy of the Napoleonic era. In just one campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte went from an inevitable, unstoppable conqueror to a man whose empire was on the brink of collapse. By 1807, Napoleon and Russian Tsar Alexander I had effectively partitioned the European continent into a western and eastern sphere of influence. Napoleon's armies were exhausted, and Alexander had faced a military humiliation against the French at the Battle of Friedland. However, as part of this agreement, called the Tilsit Alliance, Russia had to enter France's Continental system, an economic exclusion zone designed to try to weaken the British Empire. Russia's adherence to the Continental System trade embargo against Britain proved economically catastrophic, as Russia was stripped of its prior primary market for raw materials like timber, grain, and furs, leading to the collapse of the value of the ruble, widespread domestic unrest among the nobility, and even the formation of black markets and smuggling rings. The Tsar was also worried about the creation and expansion of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which was essentially a French outpost on Russia's doorstep, which the Russians believed could potentially subvert Russia's own western provinces. Additionally, in early 1811, Napoleon annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, which was ruled by Tsar Alexander's brother-in-law. This was an explicit violation of the Tilsit Alliance, which the Tsar viewed as a personal insult and a signal that the French Empire simply had no limits. Tsar Alexander became convinced that the French threatened the very survival of his empire. Even a year before, however, by December of 1810, the Tsar had already openly defied the alliance by opening Russian ports to neutral and American ships, effectively bypassing the blockade of Britain, and further, he taxed French imports. Napoleon thus claimed that the Tsar had burned the Tilsit Conventions. Both the French and Russians geared up once again for war, and Alexander touted back that blood must flow again. The campaign was even then an unprecedented scaling up of mobilization. However, as we know, Russia would be Napoleon's greatest failure. The brilliant general failed to recognize that his preferred, heretofore nearly undefeated strategy of decisive, rapid envelopment was ill-suited to the vast, underpopulated Russian interior. Russia was, and still is, one of the most logistically hostile environments on the continent. The French expected a 3-week-long conflict, but the Russians implemented a strategy of strategic withdrawal and scorched earth, effectively trading space for time. The sheer distance of Russia outstripped the French supply chain, as heavy wagons bogged down in the winter mud, and soldiers were unable to forage for food after the scorched earth retreats of the Russians. No one could feed themselves or their horses, and 10,000 horses died in the first week alone. Napoleon reached Moscow with fewer than 100,000 effective soldiers, having lost hundreds of thousands more to typhus, dysentery, and heat exhaustion before even reaching the scorched capital of Russia. Napoleon stayed in Moscow for 35 days, and even though the city had fallen, Tsar Alexander refused to sue for peace. Following a failed attempt to move south, Napoleon's disastrous 1812 retreat from Moscow became a journey of starvation, logistical collapse, and constant harassment from Russian forces, forcing the French army back along a ruined road until it hit the Berezina River, where the French found themselves trapped between 3 Russian armies. Through a miracle of engineering, General Jean-Baptiste Elbé's engineers constructed 2 makeshift bridges in freezing, iced-over water, allowing the core of the army to escape, though thousands of stragglers were left behind. Napoleon rushed back to Paris with his broken army in order to prevent a coup. While surveying the carnage at Smolensk earlier, the emperor had reportedly remarked, "Gentlemen, remember the words of a Roman emperor. A dead enemy always smells sweet." Yet by the end of 1812, it was the French Empire that had begun to disintegrate under the weight of its own overextension. Now it was the campaign against Napoleon which began. Speaking of exhaustion, whether on Napoleon's Grande Armée or us modern history buffs staying up late researching these events, getting quality rest is key to staying sharp. That's why this video is sponsored by Manta Sleep, the company empowering light sleepers like us to unlock our best lives through better sleep and the pro-nap movement. Because let's face it, a solid nap beats coffee for recharging your mind, especially when diving into complex topics like the Napoleonic Wars. I've been using their Manta Cool cooling mask, which has been a total game changer when I just need some rest and conditions aren't perfect. It features soothing cool eye cups that provide relief for dry eyes, migraines, or sinus issues, and it's perfect if you're sensitive to fans or an air conditioner while napping. Their masks are also fully adjustable with customizable eye patches and back straps, so it fits anyone seamlessly. The premium soft material gives it a luxurious feel, with zero pressure on your eyes, deep cuts for eyelashes, and breathability for side sleepers. It blocks 100% of light for total darkness, helping you fall asleep faster and nap deeper. Whether after a late night history session, or if you're traveling, or living with roommates like I am. I'm sure Napoleon's generals would have killed for one of these masks, but you don't have to. Manta Sleep also offers accessories, like their all-night comfort earplugs to help complete your setup and achieve the nap of your dreams. Head to mantasleep.com and use code MrZ, that is MRZ, for 10% off, or use the link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you again to Manta Sleep for sponsoring today's video. And now, back to Napoleon. Alright, so what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Napoleon never invaded Russia? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers in 2026, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our generous channel members. Thank you, and enjoy the video. Napoleon's march to Moscow was not universally supported within the French leadership. Several of Napoleon's closest advisors, most notably his ambassador in St. Petersburg, Armand de Caulaincourt, repeatedly warned that war with Russia would be long, exhausting, and strategically unnecessary. However, Caulaincourt recalled in his memoirs that the emperor dismissed these warnings as stories that would only scare children, convinced that his reputation alone would force Tsar Alexander to submit. Napoleon still absolutely felt that he needed to punish Russia. Russia was indeed violating the Continental system, even though it had not openly joined Britain. Napoleon himself privately even admitted the system was porous. However, Tsar Alexander continued to insist, at least formally, that he wished to preserve peace. However, France was already overextended. The Peninsular War consumed hundreds of thousands of men, the treasury was already strained, and conscription had begun to provoke growing resentment. Reports from Spain and Portugal suggested that the Duke of Wellington's army was becoming increasingly powerful, and Napoleon was kind of between a rock and a hard place. So let's assume, for the sake of this scenario, that Napoleon accepts Caulaincourt's assessment that the invasion would be a mistake. Perhaps he can be convinced that the violation of the Continental system is not Russian hostility, as Russia's behavior is driven by economic necessity. In exchange for Russia remaining outwardly supportive of the system, France would quietly accept its trade with American and British intermediaries and sweep it under the rug. Now, before you commented, yes, there is one big problem with this scenario, and that is that the Tsar of Russia was already actually planning a preemptive strike by late 1811. Even if Napoleon had not invaded, the annexation of Oldenburg and the establishment of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw both could still quite possibly have pushed Russia far enough to make it an aggressor in a war with France. Additionally, Napoleon already had many troops in Germany and Poland, which were threatening the Russians no matter what the political circumstances seemed to be. There might be a solution to this in something like financial compensation to the Russians, or a treaty that guarantees Russia's existing borders and limits on the Duchy of Warsaw, though it may be simpler just to assume that, for the sake of the scenario, the war just does not break out between Russia and France full stop. There is no Russian preemptive strike, there is no Napoleonic invasion, and though the tension will still obviously be there are no Russian and French armies fighting in Europe. We could also very well argue this to be the natural progression of Napoleon's consolidation methods during the Napoleonic Wars. After Tilsit in 1807 and after Wagram in 1809 and even during the uneasy Peace of Amiens, Napoleon had demonstrated a willingness to pause when further wars seemed counterproductive. 1812 could simply be another such pause. As Caulaincourt also observed in his memoirs, Napoleon had no difficulty in understanding political reality, but he often found it difficult to accept. In this scenario, however, we can assume this barrier to acceptance would be broken. The most immediate consequence of all of this, of course, is that the Grande Armée remains intact. By mid-1812, France would still possess over 500,000 trained soldiers, supported by functioning cavalry, artillery, logistics, and veterans of the prior Napoleonic Wars. Those veterans would be the experienced officer corps and would remain alive and cohesive and able to train new troops. There is no catastrophic loss of horses, no mass death from disease, and crucially, no collapse of morale. Additionally, the survival of shipwrights and sailors, who were historically conscripted to replace losses in the infantry, would have allowed Napoleon to continue his ambitious shipbuilding program, which he wanted to eventually, over a long period of build-up, produce a fleet of 150 ships out of the line to challenge British maritime supremacy. Now, this was not quite realistic, but it was still a goal of Napoleon's that could be further pursued in this timeline. Equally important, there is no psychological shock. In our own history, the invasion of Russia shattered the aura of inevitability that surrounded Napoleon. It convinced his allies, in name only, that he could be beaten, and encouraged the peoples he subjugated to rebel. In this timeline, that never occurs. French dominance, even though it would surely be resented by most of Europe, would still appear unbreakable. And that's quite enough to deter countries like Austria or Prussia from rebelling and forming a new coalition. Now, without the need to look east, Napoleon's attention would inevitably return to Spain and Portugal. The Peninsular War had been his greatest strategic frustration. Despite repeated French victories, Napoleon's forces remained trapped in an endless cycle of occupation, rebellion, and counterinsurgency. British troops, who were protected and supplied by their navy, continued to operate with confidence in Iberia. But now, Napoleon could intervene personally. Beginning in late 1812, substantial reinforcements would be redirected to Iberia. Veteran units that would have marched east would now march into Spain. Napoleon himself could make extended visits to the theater, imposing discipline on his marshals and coordinating operations more closely. By 1813, French strength in Spain would be able to reach levels never achieved in real history. This does not magically win the guerrilla war, of course. Spanish resistance would keep being an issue as it had throughout the Napoleonic Wars, and British financial support for the rebels would continue, and the mountainous Iberian terrain and poor infrastructure would still favor the Spaniards. However, the strategic playing field would have shifted enough in Napoleon's favor to maintain cohesion across the empire. The Duke of Wellington would be facing a far larger, better coordinated army. Large-scale offensives like that at Salamanca or Vitoria would be a lot riskier. That means British forces would adopt a defensive posture, focused on holding Portugal and Galicia. Eventually, this would turn the Peninsular War into something of a stalemate. Napoleon understood he couldn't just crush Wellington. That's why the Peninsular Wars were so long in the first place. He was especially constrained by the terrain and the Spanish guerrillas, of course, who knew it well. But also he knew he was constrained by the limits of his supply chains and the powerful British Navy. A stalemate would be manageable, but France would have to continue to spend persistent resources to keep the situation in Spain in their favor. Essentially, Spain would become a permanent hemorrhage of men and money, but one that was, for now, somewhat manageable, unlike the disastrous Russian campaigns. Now, for the Russian Tsar Alexander, the absence of a French invasion produces a very different political environment. In our own history, 1812 transformed him into the symbolic leader of European resistance. However, the Russian Empire of the early 19th century, before that Napoleonic invasion, was not a unified national state. The autocracy of the Tsar was held back by competing elites and economic interests. Alexander ruled also under the shadow of his father's assassination in 1801. His father had grown too close to Napoleon and took an anti-British stance that harmed the merchant class in Russia. He also displayed erratic behavior and attempted a suicidal mission to send Russian troops to invade India, something we've discussed in detail in another video. The murder of his father to Alexander was a reminder that imperial authority was always checked in Russia by the influence of the nobility and the officer corps. As one unnamed Russian nobleman remarked, Russia remained a system of despotism tempered by assassination. Now, the Napoleonic invasion, as we mentioned in our own history, broke that internal gridlock. It united the Russian elites behind Alexander and legitimized mass mobilization, and it gave the Tsar enormous diplomatic prestige abroad. Obviously, however, none of this would occur here. Alexander would remain suspicious of Napoleon and frustrated at the state of the Russian economy. But without the moral authority that the invasion and his victory produced, the only route forward would be to weaken the Continental system little by little where plausible. Russia could attempt to cultivate influence in the Balkans and the German states, and the Tsar could also very well turn his attention to the Ottomans alongside Napoleon, which had been discussed before, and again we discuss on a video on this channel, but most likely the outcome for Russia would be a general strategic Russian cautiousness. The risks of a general war were simply too great. For Russia to mobilize hundreds of thousands of men for a distant offensive without the popular enthusiasm Alexander had in her own history would threaten the stability of the regime itself, and would reverse the conditions that destroyed Napoleon's army and essentially put them on the Russian armies. Beyond even popular support, however, Alexander's court itself was divided between pro-French, pro-British, and isolationist factions, which would seriously constrain the Tsar. Within Russia, some of the elites were westernizers who favored reform and engagement with Europe, and some were Easterners who wanted Russian isolation and preferred to maintain the traditional autocracy. No consensus between these groups existed on how to counter France, and in fact some didn't believe it was necessary at all. Thus, Russia, it seems, would be a defensive power in a continental Cold War of sorts. Perhaps the most profound short-term consequence of avoiding the Russian campaign, though, would be that there would not arise a sixth coalition. Again, in our own history, the Sixth Coalition emerged because Napoleon's defeat made resistance appear possible. Prussia rebelled in 1813 because Russia had demonstrated that France could be beaten, and then Austria joined because the balance of power had visibly shifted. Well, it has not shifted in this timeline. Napoleon would still have serious influence over Central Europe. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw would serve as a permanent military staging ground for the French, should it be needed, which, if nothing else, would project power to disincentivize rebellion against the Napoleonic order, and the Confederation of the Rhine would now have more time to consolidate with French help as well. Prussia would certainly continue their military reforms and rebuilding, which were being led by Gerhard von Scharnhorst and Baron von Umsunstein, and the reforms were something of a revolution from above, designed to restore Prussia's military credibility without unleashing the forces of nationalism, liberalism, and popular radicalism. But again, Prussia won't rebel. Austria under Metternich would also have continued its strategy of survival through accommodation. Metternich's goal in joining the Sixth Coalition was to reassert equilibrium on the continent, hence why he developed the Concert of Europe. In this scenario, however, the Habsburg monarchy would have no opportunity for a gamble to reassert their dominance and install the concert order. In fact, the more likely route through survival would be through Napoleon. Sweden, under the installed Prince Bernadotte, would also clearly lack both the motive and opportunity to defect. So even if somehow a coalition formed, which as we've outlined is incredibly unlikely, Napoleon would be fighting it on interior lines which advantaged the French to a great degree. Britain would also continue to fund resistance to Napoleon's order, but money alone can't create coalitions. Without a continental champion like Russia, British strategy wouldn't create the conditions necessary to take out the continental system. As Karl von Clausewitz, a revered Prussian general, would later phrase it, this situation would become the continuation of policy by other means. In other words, the Napoleonic Wars would turn into a Cold War between France, Britain, and a Russia straddling both sides. It would be an economically attritional war fought through economic coercion, diplomatic pressure, and proxy campaigns in Iberia and elsewhere. Napoleon himself would be at the center of this system, now in his mid-40s. Additionally, because of this situation of temporary hegemony, the issue of his heir would no doubt become much more important. Napoleon believed his own legitimacy had its limits, calling himself a parvenu soldier, which means someone who was obscure and rose up with no noble lineage. Obviously, this wasn't as convincing to the rest of Europe as a ruler with a long line of hereditary continuity, especially because, after he's gone, his successor wouldn't have the aura of victory and inevitability that Emperor Napoleon did. While the ancient houses could withstand multiple defeats and still return to their palaces, his rule depended on being feared and maintaining a state of glory that he hoped he could institutionalize through a legitimate son. He originally considered his nephew, Napoleon Charles, as a viable successor. However, the child's death in 1807 accelerated his drift toward his 1810 marriage to the Austrian Marie-Louise, Duchess of Parma. Prior to that, Napoleon was married to Josephine de Beauharnois, but he had to go through the agonizing process of divorcing the woman he loved, as she could not produce a child. As he put it to his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, "My true mistress is the power I have created." Now, in 1811, Marie-Louise had Napoleon II, who was given the title of King of Rome. Napoleon even wrote to Josephine that the infant has my chest, my mouth, and my eyes. However, he was melancholy about his son's future. He believed he would leave his son in an entanglement that he would not be able to adequately prepare him for. Still, Napoleon would likely have the time and peace to implement his great plan for a centralized public education system. This was a component of his plan to mold the King of Rome into a modern Caesar Augustus. Napoleon intended for his son to regenerate Europe through laws and his perpetual conquests, and become the final block of granite in the Napoleonic state's foundation. Napoleon II was a living mixture of the revolutionary origins of the Bonapartes and the ancient, solid roots of the Habsburg bloodline, whom Napoleon Bonaparte believed the crowns of Europe would be forced to accept as a peer. He also intended his system to produce for Napoleon II a loyal, professional elite devoted to the dynasty, and that both this elite and his son would be an amalgamation of the old nobility and the new meritocratic service aristocracy, so that they would see Napoleon II as the guarantor of their wealth and the rule of law. It is also reasonable to assume that Napoleon II would not die young at the age of 21 due to tuberculosis. At the time of his death, he was confined in the Austrian court at Schönbrunn. In this scenario, he would be the heir to the French Empire, with access to the most eminent physicians of the age, such as Jean-Nicolas Cauversart, who had successfully cured Napoleon's own chronic ailments. This, in my opinion, would ensure Napoleon II would live to be a solid heir for the French Empire. In the meantime, however, Napoleon's new order would certainly not be without its vulnerabilities, and the most glaring of these is the Continental system itself. Even without a Russian invasion, Russia's partial disengagement from the system would continue to encourage large-scale smuggling across the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the North Sea. This produces a lot of black markets, which also normalize small-scale corruption like bribery. Corruption is a very difficult force to root out, even when it starts at the local level, and this would be as large a problem for Napoleon as, for example, the pirates of the 17th century were for Britain and Spain. The Continental system would also cause a trade depression in Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. Both Caulaincourt and Metternich independently remarked on what they called the disproportion of designs to means within the blockade. Basically, policing thousands of miles of coastline and frontier exceeded the capacity of any early 19th century state, even Napoleon's empire. That means the continental system will inevitably either end or be partially torn down organically. If we continue along this train of thought of Napoleon realizing the strategic limits of his goals, he might adapt his empire before the problem deepens. Again, Napoleon is in his mid-40s, so we can reasonably assume he would, as he had in our own history, become increasingly concerned with preserving what he had built rather than gambling it. Perhaps the French would have relaxed the enforcement of the continental system selectively, shifting toward a more pragmatic mercantilism designed to preserve the loyalty of the satellite states that depended on foreign trade, while maintaining some semblance of tariff pressure on Britain. That creates a bit more of a sustainable, simply more protectionist system rather than an absolute blockade. This also permits Napoleon's empire to cease being an engine of permanent war, and to become an apparatus of managed coercion of the polities of Europe. Over the next decade, it would evolve into a semi-permanent European bureaucratic order organized around three concentric circles. The core would be France itself. France would be centralized, governed through the Code Napoleon, uniform taxation, and a professional meritocratic nobility. Surrounding it would be the integrated satellites of Italy, the Rhineland, parts of Germany, and the Low Countries. They were forced into legal harmonization with France, and would also become economically attached to France proper through customs unions and the co-option of their elites. Beyond them would be the reluctant dependencies of Prussia, Austria, and Poland. They would essentially be vassals of this new order. Now, all of this bureaucratic order of sorts that Napoleon would be handing off to his heir, represents something like the Roman model of European governance. Europe would be ostensibly united under a multinational empire, unified by law, administration, and patronage. Over time, the meritocracy and the expansion of imperial institutions could produce a transnational imperial elite whose status depended on the survival of the system. This is exactly what Napoleon wanted to ensure his dynasty's survival, and also pretty much what ensured the survival of the Roman Empire. Of course, this would not happen overnight, nor would it necessarily be a fortified system. It would rely on surveillance, censorship, conscription, and the rule of, at least for now, of the military. Nationalist movements would continue to serve as a threat to this order, an ideology that the ancient Romans didn't necessarily have to deal with in its most radical form as Napoleon would, but the system certainly wouldn't collapse either. Its continuation and strength over time would really be dependent on the competence of Napoleon's successors. In the meantime, though, the greatest victim of this stabilized Napoleonic empire is Great Britain. Napoleon's Russian disaster triggered a surge in British confidence, investment, and coalition building, and without it, Britain is stuck in its years of grave danger. By 1812, British finances were already under a lot of pressure. British government bonds had fallen in value, the budget deficit approached £27 million, food prices soared, and an industrial depression spread across the textile districts. Britain was also facing the Luddite riots, huge workers' uprisings protesting the loss of jobs from new textile machinery like automated looms during the Industrial Revolution. The Luddites smashed machines, set mills on fire, and exchanged gunfire with British soldiers. There were also minor bread or blood riots protesting the price of food. Britain was in the middle of a genuine social crisis. However, it was not necessarily a question of whether or not stability could be reestablished, because it certainly could and probably would. We saw this in our own history. It simply required brutal methods. The question is rather how much Britain would pull back from the continent in order to reassert order at home. Britain is isolated, it alone is supporting Portugal, and no one in the Napoleonic order for now has the capacity or incentive to challenge Napoleon. Baron Jean-François Fain, the deputy of the French National Assembly, wrote that a little more effort and the blockade would have subdued British pride, and in this timeline that effort is sustained. Under these conditions, a pro-peace government is the most likely outcome. Perhaps we see the Foxite Whigs, who were an anti-war faction started by Charles James Fox, put up a prime minister like Charles Grey, as they faced pressure to negotiate. Britain thus may recognize French continental hegemony such that they could secure their colonies after the hiccup at home, and perhaps also access to select markets on the continent. With a compromise between Britain and France, Russia would be facing a bit of an existential crisis. Once again, the Polish state blocks Russian influence in Central Europe, and it provides Napoleon with a reservoir of motivated manpower, as even if the Polish come to not quite like the French order that much, they had much more visceral disdain for the Russians. And even with an easing of French pressure on Russia, Russia's economy will still continue to suffer. Much of the damage had already been done under Tsar Paul and even under Alexander. The Continental system halved the value of Russia's currency, it crippled commerce in the Baltic, and it collapsed the incomes of some of the nobles. And it's possible that the same nobility who assassinated his father would do the same to Tsar Alexander for his perceived weakness. However, even if Tsar Alexander were to be assassinated and a pro-war Tsar was installed by the nobility, Russia would still be incapable of going on the offensive against Napoleon, as we already have discussed. Its army is large, it's exhausted though, and it lacks material superiority needed for a decisive victory. And they would be making the same strategic mistakes Napoleon made in our own history, just perhaps without the factor of hostile weather. So strategically, this means Russia will be forced to a pivot outward. Constantinople would have remained effectively neutralized by French influence in the Balkans, as Napoleon informed the Russian envoy, and thus the Greek project would be an impossible goal as well. So Russia will probably strategically shift its sights into Central Asia. This means Russia continues expansion into Tartary and competes more fiercely with Britain in Persia and Afghanistan. This is interesting because it turns the Napoleonic Cold War into essentially a three-way war that probably still tilts in Napoleon's favor. Britain and Russia would both for now be economically weak and have now competing interests such that cooperation would be less likely because of the Great Game, even if France might start to fall into a period of economic stagnation that might be an opportunity for a coalition against them. Essentially, Napoleon would have forced the Tsar to choose between an infinite bankrupting war of attrition against France or the permanent loss of Russia's status as a premier European power. So Russia will be forced to act as a Eurasian power. And without war with France, the massive military and social reforms later enacted by Alexander II would have been delayed, or we just get an even more conservative reign of Nicholas I, leaving the Russian state a nation of autocracy and serfdom. Now, Napoleon himself might rule into the 1820s. However, he died of stomach cancer in 1821, and even with the full resources of the French Empire, the disease was too advanced to really be reversed. He would certainly have been provided with better care, but this period in history simply lacked the technology necessary to treat such a severe case, which had already metastasized. Still, he would leave behind a durable Pax Francia, with Iberia contained, Russia neutralized, and Britain exhausted. It would be an order prone to smaller crises quite often, but no massive coalitions to destroy it. Still, the empire would be personal, and by 1821, Napoleon II would be only 10 years old, hardly having lived enough time to be brought up by his father as the Augustus Napoleon dreamed he would be. His marshals would be rivals, and nationalism in Germany and Italy would still exist, and as we know, the Spanish ulcer still hasn't fully healed. Now, according to the Senatus Consulet of February of 1813, which established the legal framework for a period when Napoleon was away on campaign or deceased, the Empress Mary Louise would serve as an official regent. However, the actual administration would be directed by a regency council of grand dignitaries. The power behind the throne would mostly reside with Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès, the arch-chancellor and legal architect of the state, who Napoleon intended to be the effective ruler of France during a regency. He would be balanced by the arch-treasurer Charles-François Lebrun, a Norman noble and financier who Napoleon believed could be the architect of economic stability in his empire. However, Napoleon's brothers would be a bit of an issue. Joseph Bonaparte as the Grand Elector and Louis as Constable had ideas of their own worth. They might go about challenging the Regency Council to assert their status as French princes. Talleyrand, the arch-apostate, would also be a constant structural threat. He would probably maintain his existing secret communications with both the Northern Sphinx, which was Tsar Alexander I, and the Austrian Chancellor Metternich to ensure his own survival. He might not even have to interfere to weaken the French state, however. Without Napoleon's iron fist, the jealousy and envy that plagued the high command would breed infighting among the military. As the historian Philippe de Ségur noted, Napoleon had formed only able lieutenants but no leaders. Marshal Davout, the Iron Marshal, would command the most formidable professional loyalty. He was a strict disciplinarian and quite literally never lost a single battle in his entire career, and his control over the army depots and the elite military forces would make him the guarantor of order, though he was unpopular among his peers, who viewed him as a, quote, bald eagle with crusader pretensions, which would limit his political reach. Commander Michael Ney, the bravest of the brave, and Joachim Murat, the commander of Napoleon's cavalry, would likely form an axis against Davout in terms of this political infighting among the marshals. They both turned against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in our own history, and they loathed Davout. However, they lacked administrative capabilities. If they tried to act like the Roman soldier kings of old, they would surely fail, though the rebellion would serve as a broader destabilizing force in Napoleon's empire nonetheless. There would also be opportunists like Marshal Soult, who would try to carve out their own spheres of personal political influence. Soult had attempted this himself in Portugal in our own history, as did Bernadotte in Sweden. In essence, Davout, Cambacérès, and the rest of the Regency Council and loyal parts of the military would have to enforce a brittle police state on the continent to make sure that Napoleon II would be able to eventually take power in something resembling a coherent empire. The rule of law would still manage the private lives of its citizens, though. We already saw that the French bureaucracy was really skilled in maintaining order on the ground when there were crises of leadership such as 1812. However, the executive dictatorship would still be a very fragile hierarchy held together by a shared interest in avoiding a return to the conditions of revolutionary France, which would still be in recent memory. I know I'm overusing quotes in this video, but this one I found particularly interesting. Napoleon once said himself, "Chemists have a species of powder out of which they can make marble, but it must have time to become solid." And Napoleon certainly would have had more time to produce this marvel, but not quite enough to forge a truly solid, unbreakable foundation. The regency essentially would find itself ruling over a marble facade, concealing a fracturing, hyper-militarized interior that would be busy suppressing nationalism, continuing to crack down on Spain, making examples of the disloyal generals and commanders, and fighting amongst themselves for influence. The inner empire of France, the Rhineland, northern Italy, and Belgium would likely remain a cohesive centralized unit. However, the outer empire in Spain, the Papal States, Naples, Westphalia, and so forth would really start to slip. It would remain highly unstable, essentially stuck under military rule like the occupied Roman provinces. However, again, the bureaucracy on the ground level would continue to fly on autopilot, even if leadership would be in doubt or people would start to friction against the military rule. Now, Napoleon II would be growing up in all of this, just surrounded by controversy and infighting and instability and threats to his rule. Again, he only had 10 years with his father alive. Now, that would make him a really interesting figure. Really, really interesting. Because Napoleon Bonaparte would be an almost mythologized ideal that he, the son of this man, would have a duty to live up to as his heir. In our own history, Napoleon II was described as a mature, very intelligent, and well-educated, and an extremely attractive figure, much more handsome than his father, at least he was described. What I'm really interested in, though, is how he would develop, which is hard to put a finger on given he died so young in our own history. However, we have some historical examples of ruling figures who went through a similar experience Napoleon II would be going through here. Louis XIV, Peter the Great, Henry VI of England, and James VI of Scotland were all shaped by the instability, intrigue, and power struggles that surrounded the regencies of their early reigns. In each case, the father's premature death thrust a child onto the throne, where the regents, the relatives, the nobles, and the courtiers competed ruthlessly for influence and tended to treat the young rulers as pawns or figureheads. In almost every case, these rulers had a distrust of factions and intermediaries and became absolutists or centralizers as a means of self-preservation. Louis XIV literally established the absolutist system in France, using Versailles as a mechanism to neutralize the nobility. Peter the Great despised the traditional Russian elites and pushed for radical westernization, introducing some of the sort of personal autocracy that Louis would eventually be inspired by in France. King James learned manipulation and played factions and rivalries against one another. Only Henry VI of these four examples I've chosen here is a counter-example. He was over-sheltered and passive, and he lacked the assertiveness to navigate his kingdom and the intricacies of diplomacy, and this led to the Wars of the Roses. The dominant pattern, though, is that competitive regencies hardened most heirs into absolutists or centralizers who really wanted to eliminate the rivalries that had threatened their childhood. Napoleon II would be far from sheltered like Henry, and he would probably then follow a similar trajectory to someone like Louis XIV, becoming a hardened, centralized ruler not unlike Louis, though perhaps uniquely tempered by the intellectual and institutional legacy that his father Napoleon Bonaparte had left behind for him. He would likely seek to emulate his father's faux absolutist model, rather than become an institutionalizer that Napoleon had hoped for. And if we continue under these assumptions, this means Napoleon II would centralize power ruthlessly, once reaching majority, perhaps by elevating loyal technocrats from the meritocratic service aristocracy Napoleon had envisioned into a system of nobility, sidelining and purging the ambitious marshals, though devout and others would be retained as military figures. The loyal ones would be retained, but Ney and Murat, all these other people, would face exile or worse. Napoleon II would go about reinforcing the Code de Napoleon across the empire. His Habsburg maternal lineage would offer him some diplomatic leverage with Austria and perhaps soften some of the nationalism in Italy and Germany, but it would also invite suspicions of divided loyalties among the French elites. The lack of his father's personal charisma and legacy on the battlefield also means his legitimacy rests on a more reactionary framework, and any perceived weakness, whether they might be economic stagnation from the continental system, or drains on resources in Iberia, or revolts in the periphery, would be far more dangerous for Napoleon II than they were for Louis or Peter. He would have to respond brutally to enforce his control. But as Napoleon II's empire continues, the 1820s would turn it into a struggle between a centralized, multinational European state governed from Paris and the rising demand for national self-determination. This will be the main conflict of the 1820s and the 1830s and so forth. The man who was, at his birth, appointed King of Rome would, ironically enough, govern over a massive empire resembling late Rome in some regards. Napoleon II would rule a sprawling, multinational, bureaucratically centralized, yet militarily overstretched dominion, one which actually resembles the Roman economy as well, struggling with inflation, heavy taxation, and smuggling. If he is to succeed, he would have to be a Diocletian or a Constantine. This is not inherently impossible, but it is difficult. The late Roman Empire also clung to the ideal of universal Roman law and civilization, even as it split apart among the Gauls and the Visigoths and the Franks, and between the West and the East. And whether Napoleon II could master these more modern parallels to Rome's challenges is hard to conclude. But the irony is undeniable. The boy born to inherit a new Rome would rule an empire whose issues would closely parallel the one it consciously sought to revive. But that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.